So it's a starting tradition on the pod that if you would be so kind as to give us a bit of an introduction into yourself, your journey and career so far, and what's led you to make those key decisions.
Behzad Kharabi, a physician. I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry since 2016. I got my training in Germany. I'm actually originally an Iranian. I came as an immigrant as a child to Germany, grew up here in Germany, and did here my medical school. Then I spent quite a bit of time overseas. I was in Belgium, I was in the United States, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Children's Hospital, and UCSF. Went back to Germany, set up my own research lab in University Hospital in Aachen, and then joined, which was a very organic transition because I was always very interested in this basic research, translational research, and then what we now call clinical research in 2016 to go into the industry. So started my journey, which until today I feel very privileged, at Johnson & Johnson in early development, and spent there around 2.5 years. And then went and spent around half a decade at Kite Gilead, very focusing on cell and gene therapy, until I was product head for one of their 2 approved products, Tecartus. I became shortly a chief medical officer, so made the transition to a biotech and a German biotech company. And since April last year, I do my own consultancy firm, which comes with its own, I would say, very unique learnings. So that's where I am now in January 2025.
And if we were to take it back to when you initially decided to join the pharmaceutical sector, and that's a big decision, obviously you'd worked really hard to get to where you'd got to, in an esteemed level in academia. What was that key turning point where you thought, you know what, I want to make this jump?
I have been asked this actually a number of times, and I somewhat always answer it similarly. For me, it was not that I was looking to jump the industry. I was not saying, I want to be just X years in academia and just, drive off and go into the industry.
Yeah.
For me, it was really driven rather by the content. I wanted to understand what drug development is. And one of the things you start to realize at some point is, which starts to, where you need to really pivot your career, is when you see, all right, I can go this far with my academic training, right? Being being maybe a really good physician, being able to understand the disease, treating the patient, because this is the first and foremost. We're doing this because we really want to improve the care, right? When you start seeing cancer patients die, I don't know any physician that it says it doesn't affect me. And you're feeling like, man, this is not good enough, right? Yeah. We really need to improve this. This is why we do research, right? All the papers, the grants and so on, for me at least, were always just a tool. For me, this is what I really want to improve the patient care. But what you start to realize, at least for me, this I can only always speak about myself, is that I realized at some point, there were some key events in my life and back then where I realized, I understand clinical, I understand basic research, translation, mouse genetics and everything, all the tools. But how do we do drug development actually? That we come from an idea to have an approved drug. That's very hard to appreciate if you're in an academic setting. And it was at that time, I was approached by recruiters because I really didn't know much about how the pharmaceutical industry ticked. And they took my CV and I said, I really want to run pharmaceutical sponsor trials, right? I don't want to just run a trial and investigate it as in a hospital. And that's a very different world.
Yeah.
Way then drug development, which is completely different. So it was a very natural transition in that sense, rather from the angle of lack of knowledge and really understanding all the ins and outs of drug development, than rather saying, okay, I want to jump into this industry.
Yeah. So it's like you saw it as almost taking care to a different level through
because
treatments.
Yeah, because what I think one really needs to appreciate, and everyone has their own motivation to go to the pharmaceutical industry, right? For me, it was really, I felt I cannot learn here what I need to learn from myself, right? Myself set goals of really becoming a drug developer. And I feel if you really want to be a drug developer, and I think these discussions over the last 9 months, the more I would say you get more senior, the more you get accustomed to the way we do drug development in the pharmaceutical industry. There are so many different things you need to take into consideration, which you will never appreciate if you're just treating at a hospital. There is the regulatory piece. when you're marketing products, there's a commercial piece. There is the discussion with the regulators, which is a huge amount of our work, right? There's a difference between having unmet medical need and convincing a regulatory agency that your trial was designed in the right way and that your drug really is addressing that unmet medical need. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's a very different conversation.
You obviously see these academic spin-offs, early stage biotechs, that they are doing drug development. They're doing the same activities, but naturally there's a completely different way of doing things when it comes to the pragmatic side. What is it that's so different? Obviously there's the commercial, but what in the...
You mean between big pharma and small biotechs?
Yeah. So like when they're doing early phase drug development or at least preclinical drug development in an academic setting, and then you do the same thing in an industry setting, what is it behaviorally or about the people, the focus? What is it that's so different?
I don't want to throw biotech companies under the bus. So I want to be very, very respectful and mindful because you cannot generalize, right? You can have biotech companies from industry veterans who have done this over and over. They would probably run a biotech company very, very different than, and there's all right and wrong. So this is absolutely said in a non-judgmental way. But it can be a postdoc who has just a great idea and says, okay, now I want to make out of this a biotech company. What I would say is, depending on the level of seniority, and seniority for me here refers to, is this someone who has worked in the pharmaceutical industry, or is this really a postdoc? Is there a scientist in an academic lab somewhere? Again, has a very important maybe finding and says, okay, based on this, I want to now file a patent or provisional patent, and now I want to do a spin out. Where I think I would say the challenge comes, or where the education comes, is to make the appreciation. You have an idea, but you now need to bring someone in who makes out of this a product, no matter how far you're going to break it. And it can impact things such as the organizational setup. It has impacts on the trial design. It has impacts on, the moment you become a clinical stage biotech company, and I've had some very experienced clinical people, it's always the same conversations about GCP applies to everyone the same way. It doesn't matter if you have a 1 employee company or a 1 million people company. The rules are the same, And I remember a conversation with a very seasoned ClinOps lead who was doing the GCP training the last couple of years. She said, I looked in the ICH. There's no difference between if you run 5 people or 10 people company. You both have to apply to the same rule. So while I say this with a level of humor, to bring this across to someone who has never worked in a GCP compliant environment, it can sometimes be challenging because they're like, you were just going to run a clinical trial. You're not just running a clinical trial. It's not just something you're pulling off. You have to adhere to a lot of standards and regulations, and that can be sometimes tedious. And then the other piece that I would say the biotech grows is from the idea of, okay, I quickly want to test something in humans, which is always not something we do quickly test. Because this is a very ethical and important thing to do, to really say, I need to run a clinical trial in a compliant manner, but also when I see a positive signal, okay, I go direction left. But if I see a negative signal, is this now for me a justification to terminate the study, to continue the study? So, you need to appreciate the go no go criteria of a trial at the same way, right? And this is, I would say, not necessarily a challenge, but that's a learning depending from where you're coming, because sometimes people can be too far away, right? Someone's doing for 30 years industry, for them it's absolutely normal, and then I would say the clash of worlds when someone comes and says the things in a very different way, and I think both parties can grow. I would say the transition when you go from big pharma to your first role in biotech can be the challenge for the individual. I think once you get accustomed to biotech, you can learn to appreciate both worlds.
That's a massive point. So when you made that first move, what is it that's so different? Because Kite were a biotech when you joined.
I think Kite was a very unique, in a somewhat position. It was big pharma structures with Gilead, but within Kite, actually, it kept for a long time its biotech vibe. So it was somewhere in the middle. Let me call it mid-sized
Yeah, yeah,
established biotech, if that makes sense. I mean, biotech is also a very subjective term, as we would say. Biotech can be a one, three people company and can be some call Amgen the biggest biotech of the world.
yeah.
I'm not
I had
calling
Roth
it
on
Amgen now, but
yesterday.
it's a very subjective term. What is a biotech, right? And when does a
Yeah,
biotech become an established pharma? And there are probably much better people to define that than me. I would say at the moment you have a marketed product, probably you cannot really call yourself more biotech. Some may say it depends on the size. If you have, I don't know, less than 1,000 people, maybe you're a biotech.
yeah,
More than 1,000 people. I mean, I don't know. People would, for instance, call BioNTech now a biotech.
yeah. I know the
Probably
fastest
not
growing company.
anymore. But apologies, don't want to call out specific companies. I'm just giving them as
No,
example.
no, it's true, isn't it? Obviously, I have to define the opportunities that I work on, and there's so many different parameters there that people consider to be a biotech.
But to answer to your question, right? What's that transition? I think the transition is try to bring as much of this, compliant framework, which you need. You need that. There's no way around that, and make the biotech staff appreciate it. I think if the more people you bring with industry experience, right, into a biotech, the easier that can be for those. Biotech usually often is somewhat a composition of people who come from the academic setting, who maybe came with a founder or co-founder, and then they bring in individual people of the industry. I would say it requires learning from both ends and appreciation of both expertise, right? Often from the academic, there are the experts in the drug, the MOA, the mode of action, maybe even the disease.
Yeah,
And at the same time, you need to have that open mind on both ends to say, I understand where you want to go, but you still need to play by the rules, right? And sometimes that works better, sometimes it works less, but I think it's a learning on both ends to come together. I think then I see it, then I see
so like a healthy balance.
as often in life.
Yeah. If you were going to coin some key pieces of advice from going from academia through to industry, as much about behaviours or personality traits when you move in, what advice would you offer?
Well, I can only say it about myself. So every human being is very, very different. When you often make that transition, I would say you're an expert of your craft, right? I mean, yeah, I would specifically now call out really physicians, so other functions. So I want to be mindful of who I give this advice to. But for us physicians, appreciate that very often physicians in the ward, right, are the people where the nurses to go for advice. So in a sense, we are on the leadership, in an elevated leadership position. There's a lot of, responsibility lying on the physician's shoulders.
Absolutely.
Now, when you come into the industry, and maybe that's how to spin the advice. When you come to the industry, while on the one hand, depending on when you come to the industry, right, and there is the nuance of you come, for instance, after your fellowship, very, in the sense, very junior into the industry, or you come as someone with 30 years of academic as a big professor and being hired in a very elevated position. At the end of the day, what you need to appreciate is that you do not know how the industry works. It's just in reality. If you come with 5 years or 10 years academia experience, you will then still have to learn the ins and outs of how the pharmaceutical industry works. And the pharmaceutical industry just works very different. It's a different industry than a hospital, right? A lot of things when it comes to content, for instance, disease treatment are transferable. But then there's this huge piece of regulatory piece, GCP, We cannot just do what we want, right? We are very constrained. How we design studies, by statistical conversations about studies, what is the primary endpoint. And, you send scientific advice to the FDA, and then someone doesn't like the feedback they're getting from the FDA. You cannot just go to the FDA, knock at their door and say, yeah, but I don't like your advice. I'm a big KOL in this disease. Now you need to do what I did. They're going to look at you and like, yeah, okay, goodbye. So I think it's this appreciation that we are just very regulated. This is, I would say, this was for me the biggest learning. And the other biggest learning, and you will hear this when very seasoned recruiters like you approach junior people, is like, this is a metric system. The terminology, this is metrics based, different than in the academic setting very often. And I think what people need to appreciate what metrics-based really means is, because there's, for instance, a clinical lead on a program, but this is a consortium of functional leads coming together. So what you can't do is, to take a very extreme example, is you cannot go into the room and say, everyone, you're going to do this and this and this for me. right? That
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. You have to say, guys, this is the program. We have to work together and we need to support each other.
Yeah.
It's much more collaborative. And you can't just, as we like to say, you have to walk the talk. You have to become much more collaborative, right? You cannot just use sheer force, let's say,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
convincing people, if that makes sense. And this is a very important lesson, to appreciate other people's expertise and to not act as a know-it-all, and to appreciate your expertise, but appreciate, the ClinOps expertise, appreciate the stats expertise. I have learned that for me, this is definitely something I grew on when I honestly listened more to the other functions over the last 10 plus years. And I learned also most from other people in that sense. When you start to really understand the ins and outs, for instance, of ClinOps, you start to really appreciate how this all impacts your entire trial. You can write the best protocol, but if you don't pay attention to your ClinOps piece, you don't pay attention to the regulatory piece, it just has has an impact on your study. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's almost like it begins in a slightly humbling experience because I suppose a clinical setting can be quite hierarchical, and then you're going into this collaborative kind of forward-thinking environment where you simply don't know the answers. So you kind of have to build relationships with people that are also functional heads to build and accept that you need to learn from those people, and that's important.
I could not have said it more eloquently than so,
I'll take that as a compliment.
I really mean it.
And so on that journey, one of the things that really stands out about your career, Behzad, is how quickly you've ascended. So you must be doing certain things right, and I think you just spoke with them. Along that journey, you've been part of teams in various settings, not just in industry. What are the key learnings that you've got when it comes to leadership and becoming a leader, and then whilst being a leader, actually making the right decisions, which is obviously a big challenge.
Big questions, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know all the answers. So first of all, thank you. I'm moving fast. I don't know. I mean, talking to someone I know since the first day of my career, I said, it was been 9 years ago when we first talked. So why it sounds like, but it's almost a decade ago, right?
Yeah.
For me, I would say what I really have learned. You see, you can say you move from company to company if it makes sense. A friend of mine once, I met many years ago, we used to work at Kite, he's a really great guy. He said, you should never walk away from an opportunity, you should work towards an opportunity. So don't leave a company because someone else just comes and all they're giving you is more money, but there is no content attached to it. I mean, think about what the next step really is bringing you, where you bring value and you learn from that opportunity. Don't just look at it as a title or only at the monetary. I mean, all of it has to be a fit, but you also have to learn from that experience, right? And we all learn, actually. I still learn so much every single day, as much as I actually learned the first day I came to this industry. I learned different things, though, than I used to learn the first day, right? So for me, this is what I always, I was maybe a little bit cheesy, but I really chase knowledge. There's no other way to say that, right? The reason I went to Kite, for instance, was because at that time, I was working at J&J on the bispecifics. And then, I started really getting more and more interested in the T-cell based therapies. And, when Trey published his first CRS gradings, I was like, this is really interesting stuff. I mean, you take T cells and then you modify them, you give them back, right?
Yeah.
So I really wanted to go into the CAR T space, right? Because it was something, it's a very, on the one hand, it is actually, we would call it a humbling experience. You see, wow, this type of responses you get, but you start to appreciate how complex also cell and gene therapy is, right? And the reason, for instance, I left Kite really was for me because I felt a part of my journey was coming to an end. I had learned what I had to learn. I'd done really the approval, and really, when you bring a certain chapter of your career to an end, you're like, okay, there are certain things I need to. It's like you have to leave your very safe net,
Yeah.
to learn more. And I have to say I left in 2023, so it's maybe 2 years or so. I learned in these 2 years probably as much as I learned in the last 5 years or so. It's because, it's another huge accelerator. in biotech, because they're very different discussions than in established pharma, where on the one hand, you only, which is very important, doing clinical development. Right now, it's much more about, VCs, fundings, building biotech companies, and very different considerations. So this is, for me, how I made these steps, let's say. But other people have different journeys. I mean, I know some really good colleagues I really respect very dearly. They are in the same company for 15 years and they moved within the same company. And they, for instance, know everything about a certain disease. I mean, these are for me as much as KOLs as the own KOLs and the academics.
If the company can provide you with the opportunity to still learn new things, then it can be worthwhile staying, can't it? Yeah. But the window, they used to say the window was 7 years before you move. Now it's like 3 to 5, I think. But companies are now wiser. A lot of companies are now wiser that they need to be able to provide that new, because there's so much demand for certain types of people. And when it comes to managing up, when it comes to investor relations, these sort of completely new activities that are different to a drug developer as they come through the ranks. How did you tackle that?
Well, I don't know. I'm still learning. There's a lot of other things. I think you start to appreciate that there is not, by the way, just one investor. There are very different types of investors, evergreen funds, VCs, healthy, the individual offices, right? And they have... I think what you start to learn is maybe twofold. And for CMOs, it's even different than, for the chief business officer, for instance, or the CEO, because the financial piece of the organization is much more in their hands. But I would say there's two things you need to appreciate. One is you need to really closely work, ideally, with your CBO and CEO, actually, to really learn the ins and outs of how finances in the biotech world. How we do seed funding, how we do a Series A, the roadshow, Series B, IPO, and so on. You really not just have heard it once, but you have to really have done it, right? And really also continuously go as part of the executive team to investors. We have JP Morgan next week, right? To work with your team to convince an investor either to invest or not. And for that, you have to be credible. For that, you have to be authentic. And you have to be competent, I would say, for a CMO. Because they will look at you that you retain your credibility, right? I think an investor, and that's one. The other is you have to appreciate that different investors have very different views, right? Okay. Certain investors really want not only to make an investment to bring your product, they want all a return of capital, of course. But there may be some who are not, I would say, disease experts. That you may have investors who have nothing to do with biomedicine. Yeah. But they're just looking at a way of diversifying their portfolio. So you have to talk to such an investor. You cannot come to that investor and say, I'm working on a genetically modified CAR T, and they're just looking at you. I have no idea what you're just talking about. But if I give you X, I would like to have Y back at 3 years. So what is actually a very important lesson for me as a CMO, know your audience and learn also from that, right? Learn to understand who you're talking to and be appreciative. Even if you are the smartest person in the room when it comes to your content, you have to be respectful and appreciative that, okay, the person may not know anything about a drug development, but he knows his stuff as much as you do yours. So again, you said about humbling experience, and that's another, I would say, layer of humble experience to learn to be appreciative and work with a different type of investors.
Yeah, I can imagine actually. I've never really thought about it like that. Everything from family offices to kind of institutional VCs, the behaviors, personality types.
I think honestly, it takes like 10, 20 years and a zillion rounds to go through this to really start understanding. And I would even say my humble experience, I'm starting to crack this in the last two years, but talk to me in 5 years and I may understand the pieces of all these financial. You really need. That's why I think if you have a very strong CEO, not just someone who is the first time CEO, but really someone who's done this, but actually much more even the CBO, the chief business officer, these people have to be really your allies. Because you're going to learn a lot from them. I learned in the last 2 years, and it's a really privilege to work with some very competent people on this. It's actually really amazing. You start really, this is a whole new world I need to now tap into and also need to learn from.
Yeah, which is a theme, isn't it, of your career actually? It's chasing the knowledge, like you said, and that's a new
Uh,
chapter. And now in your current role, there's consultant to an advisor to various biotechs. You're kind of getting that at scale.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's actually nice because different what you become very appreciative of is, and I don't, the term consultant is sometimes very misleading because it only sounds like you're sitting there and giving some advice. Trust me,
Yeah.
you could talk to my clients. That's far. The truth is couldn't be further away. I think really good consultants are people are really who get their sleeves up and really work. So I rather like to use the term fractionated.
Yeah.
Fractionated, where
Fractional remote.
usually you
Yeah.
do full-time work, but you don't do it 100% for one company. You do it maybe 20% for the one. But the task is the same. Writing a CSR, setting up a clinical development plan, you really need to do the work yourself. You cannot just delegate it away and write 2 sentences, right? So it's actually very work heavy and content heavy, but I like it a lot, to be honest. And also, I think the other thing one needs to appreciate is the markets have changed. The markets just have changed, with everything what has happened in the biotech world from a financial side. For a good reason, maybe pharma companies or biotech companies have become very cognizant, very mindful about where to spend their money. And maybe you don't need a full-time CMO. Maybe you don't need even a full-time CEO. Maybe the first 2 years you can work with someone who works 20, 30 or 40%.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, I've seen a real increase in demand for people in that role, not just because of the risk, but also because sometimes biotechs see more value and actually less cost in it from using, say, a CRO. So they've got an operational CMO for the amount of time they need them. That's definitely a new kind of part of the market, if you like, that's really grown since all the risk and uncertainty that happened last year, following the post-COVID boom time, I suppose. And sometimes those things make people more efficient and productive and, as businesses, it's not all bad.
I think, to be honest with you, that's just my 2 cents. I think also the pharmaceutical industry has to change. I think we really need to be much more cash constrained. We need to be thoughtful about, how we're developing drugs.
Yeah.
That how we are also, and that's it again, don't want to burn bridges with people, but this was really my 2 cents of biotech companies have to be also efficient. The classical Series A, C, big Series A, big Series B, and then 3 years later, all of a sudden, either the market cap of the biotechs completely crashed or hundreds of millions have been burned and the company is gone. You really need to ask yourself of how often are we going to do this? How often are we going to pump billions in a single biotech idea with one asset, maybe 2 assets, and then a year or 2 years later, I think the statistical rate of a biotech company to succeed is less than 10%, or
Yeah.
it's just really a single-digit percentage. And obviously, when we had very low interest rates, this was a very different situation than we have today. And I think that's one thing I can say on a personal level. I can't discuss too much. Some of us are really thinking about, okay, do we really need to change the way we are running biotech companies? Maybe biotech companies cannot just be run in a classical model that you have one asset, a spin out, and then you build a whole organization around it, right? Maybe there are more efficient ways to do drug development. But I think to do that, you need to appreciate, and you cannot be attached. You cannot be attached to the product. What I'm trying to say is a founder, for instance, will always be attached to their product. There is an emotional bias. There is a dependency there. While, someone who comes with industry experience will say, I also can take a hard decision to kill an asset if it makes no sense, right? Or to terminate the asset. What I said, the no-go criteria for drug development. That's actually an important lesson. I've seen some very experienced CEOs, which probably was not easy for them, who took this decision recently. I'm not going to call them out, but that was some recent news. And towards the end of the last year, they came to the realization that their pipeline was not competitive enough, right? And I think this is a bold decision. I respect that a lot. When then the CEO says, you know what, we have to terminate these programs. They're not going to be competitive, and we need to we have to preserve the cash and see what other opportunities are because. In the end, remember, this is not their money. This is lended money from investors. So, and that's how I grew up. You have to be very respectful when you're lending money from someone else.
And do you feel like AI could help that? I know it's yeah, I know
You
it's
know, but I was like, at every call, someone is bringing up the topic of AI.
I know. And AI, what does AI really mean? But I
So
just productivity optimization. Is there something in there when it comes to the data? And
a good friend of mine, he's in the UK. He is running a biotech company. They're not technically an AI company, but they do a lot of real world evidence. He's a really smart guy. One of the smartest people I've met in my entire life. And we're always having this discussion about AI. Probably I would trigger him if I would bring this up. But I would say, in a more general term of, and I would use probably here the term AI, of optimizing trial and drug development. Maybe let's use that term instead of AI. I
yeah,
think there's huge opportunity. But so and I think the growth. I mean, you look at AI, it blows your mind how
yeah,
quickly these large learning models, or what they call it, how they learn, right?
mm,
How quickly from where we were 3 years ago. So this acceleration. I mean, it's or exponential growth. And I'm not sure that this is going to go this is going to accelerate recently. So let's do the podcast in 5 years. And
yeah. We'll be.
imagine that you ask me that AI, we all will be like, I mean, um, currently the CES conference, this consumer and in the US, I think it was the CEO of NVIDIA, Jensen, who said IT is going to become the new HR for AI. I was like,
Really?
a very interesting way to see this. I
Yeah, that
think
is,
he
isn't
gave
it?
that quote. It was on the news yesterday. But it highlights actually that, it's a very convenient term right now, but I would say computational modeling or computational support in drug development trial design, maybe that's a better way to describe it, is definitely an important thing, and you have to learn to go with it. But the individual component of people like me or others who bring in the human factor, I don't think AI is there yet to appreciate these nuances yet. And we see this when we do medical review, when we start thinking about diseases, but it doesn't mean that it can never be there. I think it can be there as a supporting tool. But in 10, 20 years, who knows?
Yeah, I know. It's impossible to predict. Because I was speaking to the head of a big pharma computational biology team, and I was asking him his views, and he said similar things actually.
Yeah.
But he did also say that wasn't there a study by Oxford or Cambridge where they addressed big pharma's spend on R&D and development of their pipelines over a significant period, and actually outweighed the upside that they got on the few products that did come through.
Yeah.
There was outliers with the likes of Regeneron and a few other companies where they've been able to have all of their launch products all coming through.
But this is a separate conversation, right? I mean, this is a
Yeah,
very distinct conversation, because what this is it inefficient. This is why I mentioned that
yeah,
inefficiencies of R&D compared to what you get out. I mean, in simple terms, if you spend more than you put in more than you
yeah,
get
yeah,
that well, it can never work that well long term. Um, AI can help maybe to make this more efficient, but I think the other pieces and what you see now is a lot of layoffs, right? That did this industry need so many people? I can't judge that, but apparently companies believe no, we don't. Maybe the processes are not efficient enough, and maybe on that end, things like AI or so on, they can improve to optimize that. Right, but I would say it's a delicate conversation, and then it's what I would also say, it's a conversation in flux where things are changing. What I think within the industry, I see more and more. I feel it being appreciated. We just cannot continue like this in a monetary inefficient way. We have to
yeah.
be more thoughtful and more efficient. That, I think, is what fairly can be said, and people start to appreciate that.
Well, when we bring you back on in 2 or 3 years, we'll be interested to see on those specific touch points
With
where we
more
are.
gray hair. No,
Yeah. There's coming here, Behzad. Don't worry. Yeah. I blame that on the children, though. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Behzad. I think that's covered everything. We'll definitely bring you back at some point to go over some of those things. But it's been really fun today, and I've really enjoyed tapping into some of your recent insights. And no doubt we'll stay in touch and catch up soon.
thank you so much, Lawrence.